Hi, welcome to Chad's Silversmithing. So I was digging through some of my old stones that I've been floating around my workshop for 20 or 25 years, and I found this piece of kind of crudely cut abalone shell, but it's kind of pretty in its own way, and it has that abalone shell multicolored kind of iridescence, which I kind of like. And so I thought, what could I make with that? Well, that'd make kind of a cool cuff bracelet. So I'm going to make kind of a simple cuff bracelet out of it. Nothing fancy, but it might be a good advanced beginner project, meaning like a beginner who's been doing it for a little while, or even a beginner intermediate. Can you combine those? I don't know. An early intermediate sort of range. You know, you've got 15 or 20 pieces under your belt and you want to try something bigger and you have a decent torch, which is kind of necessary for when you're doing cuff bracelets. So this isn't going to be a huge one or a heavy one, but it still makes it easier when it's a spread out piece like that. So before we get started, I wanted to thank some people. My patrons over on Patreon are my core group of supporters. I truly value their support, not only their financial help, which I truly appreciate. I appreciate the really nice community that they've built over there. There's a lot of cool people over there, and they share ideas and give me suggestions. It's just a nice place. So thanks for that. The other group is my YouTube subscribers, and we just passed 22,600. I think we're almost to 22,700 now, so pretty close. That's awesome. Thank you for that. I really like when I get comments from people telling me that they've gotten some value out of this, because I'd like to think that these videos are helping people. So let me know if you've gotten any good out of these videos. So I always love to hear that. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started on this project. This is one of my design idea sketchbooks that you can get on my merch store. This particular version has a gauge to inches to millimeters conversion chart, which I find pretty handy. Some of the other ones have different things. There's one that just has metric standard conversion, which is also useful for me. So get yourself one. I think they're handy. They're a great way to keep track of the things that you've made in the past. So here's what I have thought for today. It's nothing too fancy, but this is the piece of abalone shell. It's kind of wavy on top, and it's roughly cut on the bottom. I did grind away a little bit of the back here because it was really thick in one spot. And I thought if I'm going to be able to bezel set it, it needs to be just a little bit thinner. So, and I'm out of extra tall bezel right now, so I'm just going to go with my regular 3/16 stuff. It's uneven enough, though, that we're going to have to do a little bit of creative filing on the top of the bezel, too, after we put it in there. I'm just going to use some simple materials, 3.25 millimeter half round wire, which is 8 gauge half round, and I'll use a little 26 gauge sheet on the back to reinforce it where they come together, and that is 0.41 millimeters, and then some 14 gauge round wire, which I'll make into some rings to be accent pieces, and that's 1.6 millimeters if I remember right. And for the bezel, I'm going to use 26 gauge fine silver bezel strip, which is 0.41 millimeters, and I usually use the 3/16 inch height, which is 4.76 millimeters. For the back of the bezel, I'm going to use 26 gauge sheet, which is 0.41 millimeters. Alright, enough with the numbers. Let's make a bezel for this, and it's just going to be kind of a basic bezel. I was debating whether to make the bezel first or the band first, and I hadn't really decided, and then I just must have made an executive decision just right there. It doesn't really matter which you make first, I don't suppose. So we'll get this end flat. It is nice, even if you don't do lapidary much, to have a lapidary wheel you can use if you need to grind something off the back of a stone. That is kind of a handy thing. This is slightly irregular shaped. It's kind of a bracelet, would work pretty good for unusual things. I think I was in the mood to do something, you know, find something unusual to set. And I don't think I've ever set a piece of rough abalone shell like that before, so it'll be an experiment. I'm shooting this video a day earlier than I usually do because I have to set up for one of the two big shows that I do every year. This one's in Loveland, Colorado, and I'll be in booth B13 if anybody wants to swing by. It's Loveland's Art in the Park. It's most days this weekend. It's a nice show, but I think it's supposed to be a hot one again. Okay, if you haven't been to my channel before, I use primarily hard silver sheet solder. Now this is a fresh piece because my little piece is getting too small to really cut things off of very effectively. I use a liquid flux that I dribble on with a dropper bottle. Torch I use is a Silversmith model. It's an acetylene air torch. It draws in atmospheric air to mix with the gas on the tip. It produces a nice, it's a hotter flame than propane or butane generally, but not as hot as oxyacetylene, so it's kind of great for silver. I really like it. And I use a #1 tip for the most part. Okay. One thing, when you're making kind of big bezels like this, I've never made a big one before, so I usually make them into squares or rectangles. I go in a third, and then about halfway down the middle of this one. I didn't quite get it on the nose there, but then just getting these two to meet in the middle. But when you have a big bezel like this, it's kind of flimsy. And getting those two ends to push together nicely, which is something that's desirable in general, is kind of hard because they flop around a lot. But if you put a little dimple in the bottom of the bezel like that, it makes it a little bit springier. You can get those two ends pushing together pretty nice most of the time. You know, supposing Chad filed those nice, which is an open question. Just threw a few of those right off the table. Alright, let's kind of get this shaped back into almost a circle. I think we're pretty good size-wise. Okay, let's find some 26 gauge sheet. There's a piece. So this is basically going to be mounted on top of the band, so it doesn't need to have a lot of super thick silver on the back of it. It's not going to get a lot of tension there, so let's see. I guess I can use this one. So the more mass you have on the bottom of a big bezel like this, the harder it is to solder it down, because you need to heat it without overheating the bezel. And since you're coming at it from the top, generally that's easy to do, especially for beginners. So getting rid of a little of the mass on this piece that I don't really need to be there just overall aid us in making it a little bit easier to get that bottom sheet up to temperature, because it's kind of protected. Now there's ways to get around that. You can use one of those tripods if you want to get the flame underneath it, or you can balance it across two things. My friend Flying Chef, this has got stuff in it. I wouldn't do it with stuff in it, but does it like this, kind of with these little crucibles, and sets them on there so you can get the flame underneath. That makes it easier to get the bottom piece hot. However, I think we can manage here, so. The disadvantage to using a thin sheet is sometimes when you flux it, because it's hotter and colder in different spots, especially because of the flux changes the temperature dynamics, it'll warp the sheet. So, and that's always makes it a little harder to get that sitting down there so it wicks along the seam when you solder it. Let's throw it here. I might cut a few more here. This is a pretty good sized bezel. Just push these right up against the edge there. So, another method you can do to get underneath it if you need to is tip it up like this. Heat the sheet from the bottom. That way the bezel isn't exposed to the direct flame, but it's still going to get pretty hot. And you start to see things melting a little bit in the soldering. Then we can switch over to the top here. Sometimes I tap it a little bit on top like this to make sure we have contact all the way around in case any of that warping happened. We don't want to have a little gap somewhere. What would people say? Say, oh man, Chad made a really pretty bracelet, but he left a big old gap in the bezel. Shameful. Okay, I'm just going to trim off the excess on this one. You can, of course, use your saw if you're one of those sorts. And I did not mean that in a derogatory way. Some people find it soothing to saw stuff. I'm not quite there yet. I do find it soothing to file them. Okay. Now let's make a band. I already cut a couple of pieces of this 8-gauge half round to be pretty close to the right length. I think I measured to about 6.5 inches. That way when we bend them outwards, it'll shorten them just a little bit. So we can also cut them shorter if we need to. But that's a kind of a good in-between size for bracelets, I feel like. So I'm going to file these ends so they're both flat. And then I'm going to spend some time getting them straight. Okay, I'm going to get them as flat and as straight in both dimensions as I can. I find when I'm doing this, I have better luck if I just hold it with the pliers. And I like these wide nose pliers, it doesn't ding things up as much. Use your fingers to kind of do the bending. Let your fingers do the walking. Now that is going to make me old if I know that particular little jingle or slogan. Bonus points if you can tell me what that was from. Let your fingers do the walking. There's an ad for something. Back in the 70s, maybe the 80s too. I have an amazing amount of advertising jingles floating around in my brain from back then. That must have been an effective way to advertise because you still remember those things after 40-some years. It's a pretty effective memory device. Okay, we got a little work to do this direction here. Kind of curves in this way on this one. That's not too shabby. And I actually got the length pretty close, so let's do this. We need to bend it in a couple of ways. We need to bend it outwards in the center, and then bend the outer edges outwards on each side to make them meet up nicely. This about half as much as this bend. So let's find the center first. That should be pretty close. If my ruler's remotely accurate. One way you can check is just to flip it around and line up the ends. Yeah, pretty close. Got it right across there. Now, kind of arbitrarily decide how far we want this bend to go. And I usually do it maybe 1/4 of an inch, or, you know, like 5 millimeters or so, maybe 5 or 6 millimeters. Easy way to get it symmetrical is do it across one side like that. Flip one of the wires around. Then you can just extend and mark straight across there. And we have our bending points. So you can bend them just by holding them flat on the table and using some flat nose pliers like that. For these initial bends, I usually use the edge of the table like this. Hopefully you can see this. If you got a sharp edge table, you can just kind of bend it like that, and then it'll give you a little start anyway. Oops, I went a little bit further on that one. Let's do just a little bit further here. That's pretty close. So then on these ones we have to go back the other direction. So just like that. That's not bad for a first go around. I usually have to do some unbending or rebending a little bit on corners, but this one's not too far off, so I might be able to just use that. Kind of arbitrarily deciding how wide I want that, and that looks pretty good. I like that size. So let's, I'm going to see if I can find a little scrap 26 gauge. Like I had a piece that I cut off of an edge. This might not be long enough. Let me find a little bit bigger piece. You could just solder these next to each other if you wanted to. I just like to get that little extra bit of strength, you know. So we'll just solder it on the back side of it like that and then trim off the excess. Makes sense? This is where the point at which, if you have one of those little butane torches, you may start running into problems because they just, while they're cool little torches, they have a limitation on the size of the piece you can get up to temperature because they just don't produce enough heat. I would recommend you make all sorts of pretty stuff with that. Sell it all to all of your admirers and take the profits and get yourself a little bit hotter torch. You'll thank yourself for it. My biggest trouble when I do this is getting the piece of sheet straight. At least some reasonable facsimile of straight. That wasn't very good, Chad. So I have a number of pieces of solder over here. I'm going to flux this and then we'll put a little bit on either end and then go solder down. Okay, so let's file these down. I usually round these off a little bit so they're quite so angular. See, I didn't quite get that one straight. This one's pretty good. Okay, so make sure that's pretty close to the center, but I think I'm going to make a couple of circles to fit in there. Okay, so let's... Sometimes I use my dapping punches as something to wrap things around to make circles. Let's do a couple around this thing and see how they look. I think that'll be nice, maybe. Right there. Let's cut two of those off. That might be cool if it's like sticking out partially hidden. Let's try one about here. So this is just kind of a basic one of these. There's all sorts of variations you can do for them. You can make them as complicated as you want. There are multiple stones. You can have more intricate designs. You can have features like a hidden compartment or something. I like making stuff with different features like that. They may need to be a little bit smaller. Well, let's take a little piece out. That's kind of more where I was thinking. I'll make sure everything's laying nice and flat. Make sure these are all flat. If you have too much of a wobble, it could be a problem. I usually try and put the solder joint up against the edge. That way you kill two birds with one stone. Okay, I think let's solder those two in first. And I'm going to do something called pick soldering, where I pick up a little bit of solder and put it where I want it to go. You don't have to do that on this one, but it's a useful technique to learn if you're interested. I'll link up there for you. So you could solder this on flat like that. However, I've found that that creates a bracelet that has a big flat spot on the top, which I don't think is all that great. So I usually bend it around something a little bit so I can mount it with a slight curve like that. And then I can kind of like see where I want it exactly. So if it leans to one side too much like that, you can adjust the weight distribution. Like this one sits a little too low, bend it upwards. It'll sit a little better. And this one downwards just a little bit. That redistributes the weight, and that's pretty good right there. I usually tell people to tuck a couple of pieces of solder underneath or up against the outside edge of the band here. And we need to get the base hot and also the band, so we gotta visit both. Let's cool it off and take a peek. See if we got a good connection. Try and yank on that pretty good, make sure we're on there. I think it looks alright, so I'm going to bend it into a shape that'll fit in the pickle. That'll give you an idea what it'll look like too when it's all cleaned up. Cool, well let's let that pickle and we'll finish it up. So I got things polished up, and a couple of things to note. I did put a little bit of this compressed cardboard as a backing in spots to raise it so that this is close to the top. But I did need to do just a little bit of grinding on the top of the bezel to get rid of some of it so that it matches the contours of the stone. Other than that, we're ready to go. I do this a little differently than some people. I use my the flat side of my chain nose pliers as a bezel pusher. So we'll start with that. Just kind of push this down all the way around. And once that's all pushed down, then I'm going to use the rounded outer part as a burnishing tool. Just really lay some pressure on the top edge there. Alright. And I'll do a little bit of cleaning up with a blue fine wheel on the Dremel just to get the top edge a little smoothed out. And these I usually mostly hand shape them, but you can wrap them around just about anything. If you don't have a bracelet mandrel, that's okay. I used to use a propane tank to get it started, and then mostly do it by hand after that. Some people use aluminum baseball bats if they don't have a bracelet mandrel. That'll work. We'll kind of want to get it to look nice and symmetrical. Alright, that's kind of what I was shooting for. Interesting way to set a piece of abalone shell. Someone will love that, you know. Alright, well, I'll get some better pictures and put them at the end. Okay, well, that was kind of the simple abalone shell cuff bracelet. I hope you enjoyed that and found it useful. If you did, would you mind hitting the like button? That really helps to get my channel promoted. And I'd love it if you'd take a moment and go to my main channel page on YouTube here. I have 500 plus videos now, so there's quite a bit of content over there for you to peruse. And I'm sure that you'll find something good there. Even if you're an experienced metalsmith, you might find some good ideas for to stimulate your creative process. So feel free to peruse those. And then make sure to subscribe to the channel. I put out 3 videos per week, one on Tuesday, one on Thursday, and one on Saturday. And I've been doing it for about 3.5 years now, so I've produced quite a catalog of stuff over there. So the other thing is, don't forget to hit the video description down below. In addition to details about the video itself, you'll find some important links. There's a link to my Patreon if you want to find out more about that really cool community. There's a link to my merch store should you want to get yourself a nice design idea book or some other merch. And there's a link to my ebooks, which the latest one is 2024's video tutorial guide. It has a page for each of the tutorials that I did in 2024 and includes additional information as well, like pictures of the sketch, the final product, a list of materials needed for the project, difficulty rating, things that I thought about while I was doing the project. I have some notes about each one. Talking about things like would I have done it differently if I was to do it again? What did I learn from that? What things did I notice were difficult or hard about it, and what were easy? Stuff like that. So it's a really valuable resource and a nice way to have a whole bunch of projects right at your fingertips. And I think it's also a nice way to support my channel if you get it. So thanks for that. All right, well, thanks for coming. Take care. Happy silversmithing.